I don't know the whole. Most of the time that we don't pay attention to people at high level jobs, big bankers or traders in the stock markets use vitamins and others.
The idea of addiction as a concept really becomes a popular idea in cultures only in the first half of the 19th century, first half of the 1800s. And the actual word addiction in English only takes on this specific meaning of being about drugs and alcohol somewhere around 1900. So it's not a concept that goes back to antiquity. It's a, relatively speaking, a modern concept.
Well, you know, addiction is a complex process, and it's difficult. It's been difficult for a long time to come up with very simple definitions of addiction. Epidemiologists spend a lot of time trying to come up with various testing measurements where they can have precise definitions. But it's a difficult thing to do. But I think most people think of addiction as a transition that takes place from using drugs, abusing drugs, and then in a susceptible few, and it's a relatively small few who experiment with drugs that go on to have troubles with addiction. That's usually characterized as something like compulsive patterns of drug-seeking and drug-taking behavior, where the drug sort of occupies an inordinate amount of your time and your thoughts in terms of procuring it. The other feature that's very important clinically, of course, is that addicts will often tell you that they have a strong desire to stop, but they have a lot of difficulty doing so. So this combination of sort of loss of control over your life, in the sense that drugs come to occupy such an important part of it, and an inability to stop, even when you want to, I think are the two kinds of defining characteristics of addiction that most people agree on.
Addiction, first of all, is a concept that, a word that doesn't even exist in all languages, or a concept that doesn't exist in all languages. And it's a very complex concept, I think, for everybody who uses it. I think it's an interpretation of a behavior where you don't know exactly, or where the causes are various kinds, and where the course of this can be very different for different persons. So, I think it's really very, it's a social construction, you could say, in a way.
If I'm asked, I would say it's my job to listen more than to tell. If I listen to someone who's troubled by their use of cigarettes, they've started to think they don't want to die of lung cancer, and they gave up last week, but they're using it again now, and their wife is cross about it, and their children are angry, and they're telling me, I'm listening to them. I don't need the word. I know that something is gripping them, something has held of them, something has taken over, something has insulted their personal integrity.
I can give my view, not a definition, if that's your question, because I think the way you look at addiction depends on what the aim of your question is. If it's from the perspective of treatment, for example, it makes more sense to define it as a disease, and then you have to make a diagnosis, and then you can send someone to treatment, and that is paid by the health insurance. From that perspective, it makes sense to look at addiction as a disease or not. But if you look at policy measures, for example, nuisance from alcohol, or nuisance from drug addicts, or you have to make laws in the European Union with respect to illegal drugs. Then addiction is a more social from the perspective of sociology or is more cultural colored. And then it doesn't matter whether addiction is a disease. In fact, it's perhaps not a good way of looking at it, a disease, but then it's a societal phenomenon. And then you have to look at the consequences for society, whether what addiction is. And well, for the individual, I think the outcome is the harm from a behavior for the individual. And sometimes it helps when you think of addiction as a disease, but it can also be stigmatizing a person.
Now, I'm an animal researcher. I work on preclinical models, so my problem is not how do you tell whether a person is an addict, but how do you tell when a rat is an addict? And in a sense, that's even more challenging. In the preclinical research field, what we try to do is take our leads from the kind of diagnostic criteria that are developed by the psychiatric community, for example, in what's called DSM-4 or now DSM-5, which is basically the set of criteria that you need to meet to make a clinical diagnosis of addiction, which consists of a list of symptoms, and they include things like continued drug seeking in the face of adverse consequences, continued drug seeking when you know drugs not available, pathological motivation for drug, that is the willingness to work very hard to get drugs. And all of those kinds of symptoms you can actually study in animal models. And so addiction in animals is defined as meeting, again, a certain set of symptoms or criteria. Addiction is a complex set of symptoms, and even in humans, it's how many criteria you meet defines sort of the severity of addiction. And you can ask similar kinds of questions in animal models, even though you can't ask them about the extent to which they've got in trouble with the law or the extent to which it's influenced their work. But you can ask something about these other kinds of core features.
Even if rats are very similar to human beings, there are some crucial differences that can be very decisive. It's not only about dopamine or the levels. It's something that explains that that people can stop and can change and that, as he said also, human surroundings are infinitely much more complex than a rat in a cage.
The last speaker, and they have an outsider that